Yeah, we're on page Ches, and we started section Bays on the right side, Sharp Sulim. And we said that there are many, many different permutations and different possibilities. In a case of a carbon that was kosher and then it became possible, is it mafkia, the Kedusha Guf? Or perhaps the Kedusha Guf is not poka and it still remains. We spoke about behemoth chulin that are possible, that disqualified for krova, and then he was magdish them. Can the Kedusha Saguf be chal on a behemoth that's chulin and is disqualified for krova? And then we said that even with regard to a case where you have a posel of carbon and then you were magdish it and it is chal, is it going to be Kedushas Damim or is it going to be Kedusha Guf? So that's a general introduction to what we want to study today. So case number one is where was mafresh a nekeva for a carbon asham. Asham is a carbon which can only come from a zachar. So he starts by quoting a Mishnah in Tvura on Daf Yutesam Beis, and it depends. Ima dailo vikrivat shomo. So he's still chayav a carbon osham, and he wanted to fulfill his obligation vis-a-vis a carbon osham by bringing a nekeva, which he cannot do, but still he was mafresh this carbon with a chovas gavra, with an outstanding obligation vis-a-vis asham on his shoulders. In other words, we're going to find a way in which he can fulfill his obligation with a nekeva, which is, at first glance is impossible. How could you possibly reconcile the fact that Adayin lo hikr b'shav is still chayv in asham with the fact that he was mafresh in a nekeva, which cannot be an asham? And the answer is that domel li'asham. This animal itself, which is in the cave, is disqualified, but we can, so to speak, convert that animal, transform it into a zachar. How do we transform it, a cave into zachar? We sell it on the market, and with the monies that we receive as payment for the asham, we can buy a zachar, which will now be kosher l'asham and now allow him to fulfill his obligation to bring a carbon asham. But im kvar karav hashamu, if a person already brought a carbon asham, that means he fulfilled his obligation, and out of the clear blue sky, he was mafresh in a cable l'asham. Is then we don't have to find a way of reconciling his hafrasha with his chovas gavra because he no longer has a chovas gavra. But on the other hand, he was mafresh the nekeva, and what halachic sense or what significance can we get from the fact that he was mafresh this nekeva? He can't tell me that he's coming to fulfill his obligation. He already fulfilled his obligation. He brought a carbon asham. And the answer is Yiplu Damel Linidava. He's accepting upon himself a voluntary carbon. Again, this particular animal cannot fulfill that voluntarily accepted obligation of an Nidava because he accepted upon himself a Nidvas Asham, and he was mafresh in the keva, which cannot possibly come as an asham. But what we could do is we could sell the nekeva, and that money will fall into the general category of an adov. Okay. So if I understand correctly, there are two ways of understanding his hafresh and what the nature of the obligation that results from his hafresh is. One way of defining and classifying his hafresh is that he is obligated to bring a carbon. And if this animal can't serve to fulfill that obligation, he'll have to find another carbon that would fulfill that very obligation that he committed to himself. In other words, he pointed to this animal and he said, I want this to be a fulfillment of my obligation of a carbon asham. And he's still obligated to bring a carbon asham. He hasn't yet brought his carbon asham. So now this animal will have to serve as a conduit, an intermediary through which he will fulfill his obligation to bring a carbon asham. That's called domela asham. But what about a person who has no obligation to bring an asham? He already brought his asham. Then we define his hafrasha as a nedava. He accepted upon himself to bring a nedava. He cannot use this animal as a nedava because he called it a carbon asham, which an akeva cannot be a carbon asham. So therefore, yiplu damel linedava. Now I'm going to make the following assumption, and I hope I'm right and not wrong, but I could be wrong. That in both of these cases, once the damim were used either for a carbon asham or for a nedava, that carbon that he was mafresh becomes chulun. And nechliku tanoim bazel. Rabbi Shimon yachol liftosa af below mum shlo chalva el kedushas damim. L'chacham tzarech mum liftosa shechalva kedushas guf af sheina ru'uya la'akrava mikom kom migo denachtala kedushas damim nachtala kedushas aguf. Now, I'm not understanding exactly how the speaker works, but let's see if we can analyze. In this machlokas tanoim, my impression is that intuitively the chachamim are correct. Which means what? That we're going to define and classify this animal, which he was mafresh in the keva la'asham, as kedushas haguf. Let's take the first scenario. He has an outstanding obligation to bring a carbon asham. He hasn't yet fulfilled his obligation. He needs kedushas haguf. We may need to translate or transfer this kedushas haguf over to another animal from this animal, because this animal is in a cave and he needs a zachar. But nevertheless, his intention was to generate a kedushas haguf by being mafresh this animal as an asham. And if it won't be this animal, let it be a substitute animal. And that's kedushas haguf. Again, I find this a little bit complicated because what do you mean Kedushas Guf? You're now being poder. It's only after there's a mum. Oh, I see. Yeah. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun here. We're going to have to say that there is a Kedushas Guf, and Pidyon is only feasible after there's a mum, because he can't be poder Kedushas Guf. But now the Chacham have to ask the following question: how could Kedushas Guf possibly be chal when he was mafresh a nekeva as an osham? It's not roilim is bad. And here's where we introduce the Chacham introduce a migu. Migu de nafka, the nachtale kedushas damim nachtalo kedushas haguf. What does that mean? I mean, I can translate it literally. If we go back to Rabbi Shimon, now he makes sense. Why? Because he's saying that lo chalva el kedushas damin, that the whole enterprise of being mafresh and ikeva liyasham is kedushas damin, and therefore be poded. I'm not exactly sure, according to Rabbi Shimon, why halach is damel liyasham. But that might be a different story. That might be just a chovas gavra that he has to fulfill because he hasn't yet fulfilled his asham, and therefore the halacha is damel la'asham. But in and of itself, if you focus on the kedusha that was generated by his hafrasha, it's got to be a kedushas damin. And it's interesting because even the Chachamim, when they apply Kedushas Haguf, it's only based on a migu. And this migu is somehow meant to quiet down, to quell the curiosity of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon's asking, how could you Chachamim possibly define this Mafresh Nekeva Liyashim situation as Kedushas Haguf? It's not Roilim is bad. How can there be a Kedushas Haguf? And the Chachamim, in order to justify the Kedushas Haguf, they come up with this migu. I don't know how this migu operates, but there is a migu to answer the objection of Rabbi Shimon. What is there? Again, Rabbi Shimon is asking the Rabbanan, how could you possibly generate a Kedushas Haguf on something that's not royal mizbeach? At best, you could call it a Kedushas Dam. Its value belongs to Hegesh, like I was Magdash's table. And the Chachamim respond with a migu, the mechanics of which we don't understand. If we did, it would be a great achievement. The migu says that we start at like level number one with Kedushas Damim, and somehow that develops and matures to become a full-fledged Kedushas Haguf. But it lends itself to pidyon. Why? Because there's a mode. You've got like A, B, and C. A is that it's Kedushas Damim. B, therefore, I'm sorry, it's not the other way around. A, it's Kedushas Haguf. B, therefore I have to wait for a mum to reduce it to pidyon, to Kedushas Damim, and allow for pidyon. And C, how did you get to a Kedushas Haguf? It's because of Kedushas Damim. And somehow magically the Kedushas Damim evolves. You know, it's like if your wife bakes challah, she puts all the dough, and somehow, if it's not careful, the dough starts spreading out. So you start with Kedushas Damim, and then it expands to become Kedushas Haguf. such that now I need a mum in order to allow for the pigeon.
And when they do the pigeon, the offer that they buy with it is going to be useless.
Correct. Because there's nothing being ma'akiv to his bath, and therefore it could be a full-fledged kedusha guf and fulfill his obligation of Osham.
So isn't there the potential in the Nekeva to become kedusha as a guf because
maybe you're right.
through the pigeon?
I would have said that the purchase itself is what generates the kedushas haguf. So he purchased a zachar. By purchasing a zachar for the purpose of kedushas asham, that's what generates the kedushas asham. But you're saying, and I think you're right and I'm wrong, based on this migu, that somehow
there's a little kernel of it there.
In the kedushas damim, there's a kernel of kedushas haguf, which will will manifest itself when he takes the damim after the pigeon and buys the zachar. I'm not sure. Do we have a clear nafkamina between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim? Yeah, Rabbi Shimon doesn't require a move because Rabbi Shimon thinks that from A to Z, the entire kedusha exhausts itself in kedusha's damim. There is no inherent kedusha saguf since it's not royal mizbeach. Rabbi Shimon is 1,000% correct. Why you hacking me with mum? I don't need mum. A magdish this table. It's not lemizbeach, it's kedushas damim. I'd be poded. I don't need a mum. And an animal is no different than a table. I'm just being magnish the value of the animal because it's not royal lemizbeach. I don't require a mum in order to allow for pigeon. Based on this migu.
Use when he does the pigeon. Could he have used that money for any other purpose other than?
Well, that depends. That depends if he was makriv his osham. So he had a chovas kavod.
Oh, if he was.
If he had already been makriv his kavod osham, then we'll take the money and we'll use it for an olas l'dov.
It still has to be something from the bank.
Correct. Right. And the question is, how would Reb Shimon explain that? Because if Reb Shimon holds that when you mafresh in the cave as an asham, then from A to Z, all you have here, the entire kedusha exhausts itself in kedusha's damim. So why do we have to use the damim for a carbon, for an olah? Olas the damim, but why? Why not just use the damim to build the base of it? To pay the workers to fix the Kodesh Kodshim if there's any breakage in the walls. So we leave this paragraph behind us with a question of how to understand the migu of the Chacham. I have a suspicion that you'd have to be a real bucky in Kodshim in order to explain this migu. That's my intuition. Next, hamafresh nekeva la'olah. Now there is such a thing as an olah, which is an nekeva, but that's only an ophos. But now we're talking about behemos. So just like an asham requires a zachar, so too a carbon olah in the case of a behema requires a zachar. So the halacha now is that yavi b'dameha olah. Again, are we talking before there's a mum, after there's a mum? Let's just see if we can work this out in a theoretical sense. If we go with the chachamim of nekevas asham and apply the same yardstick and rules to nekevas olah, then we would require a mum. And now the question is, after the mum, what do we do with the money of the pigeon, and we're going to use it for an ola. Again, what kind of an ola are we talking about? Let's just see. He has a footnote here. I don't know if it's relevant to us. Kuf samachay. Shitas aram shumel li el bevlad ola shedamav li olas yachid. Kam imo damel li olas yachid. So he has a machlokas rishonim when it says damel li ola. What kind of an ola are we dealing with? Are we dealing with an olas yachid or an olas hatzibur? And that once again, these are questions and issues in Kodshim that go way beyond the purview of our introduction. Now, let's go over to Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon said in the case of Mafresh Nekevali Asham that we're poded because it's from the get-go a Kedushas Dami, we don't need a mum. Logically, the same should apply to a Nekeva of an Ola. But Nechleku Tanoim B'shitas Reb Shimon, Mafresh Nekevali Asham ain't Tzarch Mum Liftoso, Canaan did. According to one opinion, the same thing applies to Mafresh Nekevas Ola. And that is intuitive. We don't need to explain that. That's muvan me'elav. Why should we differentiate between an nekevas asham, which is a kedushas dam, it doesn't require a move for pigeon, and an nekevas ola? However, was there, according to another opinion, divrei hakol, meaning even Reb Shimon agrees that a kol tzarich mum lifdosa. Divrei hakol tzarich mum lifdosa. Which means Kedushas Haguf, by the way, because that's what we said in the Chachamim in the Nekevas Asham, and now the Rabbi Shimon is agreeing, I disagree with the Nekevas Asham, that's clearly Kedushas Damim, because it's not royal in his path. But in the case of the Nekevas Ola, according to one opinion, Rabbi Shimon all of a sudden adopts the position of the Chachamim that there is Kedushas Haguf. How could there be Kedushas Haguf in an Nekevas Ola, when an Ola has to come from its Zoch? You'll ask me the Rabbanan. Okay, the Rabbanan had this magical migu that since it has Kedushas Hadamim, it matures and it develops to become a Kedushas Haguf, which means that there's no pidyon without a move. But Rabbi Shimon never bought into that migu, and apparently, according to one opinion, in the case of Olas Nekeva, Mafresh Olas Nekeva, Shimon would accept this migu. Now go figure out what's the difference between an Asham and an Ola.
So you think it's only the one from the store that he's talking about?
When you say about it, tzibur, that's only what do we do with the monies after the pigeon? We direct it towards an olas tzibur or an olas yochid. That was a machlokas quoted here in the note between the Rambam and Rabbeinu Gershon. He writes here that in a mafresh nekeva li'ola l'divrei hakol oset mura. Right, that should be reflective of the second shita here. That l'divrei hakol mum tzarich mum lifdoso means it's sanctified with kedushas haguf, and therefore you could use it for tmura. But we said in the first opinion that Reb Shimon, being consistent with shitasa with mafresh nekeva li'asham, would say the mafresh nekeva li'ola is Kedushas Damim without any vestige of Kedushas Haguf. You don't need a mum to be poded, and therefore would certainly be a Behemoth Chulin as far as Tmur is concerned. Achagmara Huva B'Braisa Shadas Rabbi Shimon Ben Yehuda, another Reb Shimon, Kedas, Bidas Rabbi Shimon, Shigamla Olaso, Eino Ole Tmura. Eino Ole Tmura, which means that Nekeva Lolaso, like Nekeva Li Ashmo, is Kaddish B'Kedusha's Domim, and therefore cannot create Tmura because of Atosis. Shigamla Iyan of Itzarach Mum Lipados, Netlik Bazeh, in the Reb Shimon Tzricha Mum, well, ain't it Tzricha Mum, but he also give you a clue, even a hair's breadth of an explanation as to why Olas, Nekevas Ola should be different than Nekevas Asham. Now, one second, Steve, you mentioned the word Nidava. The Yachin and Tzib, I don't know if it's relevant to us, but did you mention the word Nidava? Let's make maybe you mention the word Nidava, okay? Because I'm thinking out loud, Ola is very much different than an Asham. Right, there are 5 categories of a carbon asham, but in each category you did something, you violated some avera, which generated a chiyuv asham. There's asham ilos, asham zelos, and so forth and so on. Charufa. I mean, in the case of an ola, we don't need any background. You don't need any baggage or criminal record in order to bring a carbon ola. Ola is babin and dava. There's no such thing as a dava and an asham. I'm just thinking already. See in front of our eyes that Ola is a more all-encompassing karma than an asham. And maybe that could express itself in this nafkamina according to Shimon, that even though he was mafresh on a keva, that's already a psul mizbeach. You can't bring an olas nekeva onto the mizbeach, but it's no worse than an adava. What do I mean? That he took upon himself to bring a korban olah. He messed up in terms of this animal, in the sense that this animal can't be brought on the mizbeach. But the fact that he took upon himself to bring this to David, that could generate a kedushas guf in the animal. But in any event, one thing is clear, we see this over and over again, that when you talk about a behemoth that theoretically could be brought on the mizbech, it's a whole different story. If he was mafresh for a carbon, even though it's kedushas damim, because you cannot bring this animal on the mizbech, but he was magdish as a carbon. They're like zwei dinim here, the 2 din. There's one din of behemel of mizbech, and then there's another shame carbon, which is a more generic kind of shame that applies to behemos when he was mafresh for a carbon. And that shame carbon is chal and can generate a kedushas haguf. And that's why we need a move in order to allow for pidyon. Within the context of Reb Shimon, we might postulate a difference between Asham and Shlomin, Asham and Ola, in the following sense, that Reb Shimon is unwilling to recognize a hafrashas carbon without the possibility of mizbeach in the case of an Asham. But when you have a generic carbon Asham, then even though I can't bring it on the mizbeach, it still has inherently a kedushas haguf. Now, finally, just to sort of wrap things up here on this topic, we have the Nekeva of Pesach, Mafresh Nekeva of Pesach, and once again, a Korban Pesach has to come from a Zohar. Is now we have Machlokas with Shimon and the Chachamim. Do we need a mum liftosa, or even without a mum, we can be poded because Reb Shimon maintains that it's kedushas that of kedushas damim. So at this point, we are taking our paradigmic case of the Kevas Ocham and applying it to the Kevas Pesach with the same identical machlokas between Rab Shimon and the Chachamim. The Imnafal Ba'mum Kodem Shehichriv Pischo Harei Domel LePesach. So again, he has an outstanding obligation to bring a Korban Pesach. Now, before he was makriv his Korban Pesach, a mum fell onto the animal. So again, which animal are we talking about? This is a little bit tricky here. There are two different animals. There's one animal that he was mafresh as a Korban Pesach, and that's a zochar. Then he was mafresh a nekeva as a Korban Pesach. According to the Chachamim Shita, paradoxically, that was the whole Chiddush of the Rabbanon. In this nekeva, there's inherently a kuchas haguf, which blocks pigeon without a mum. Okay, now the question is, once there is a mum in this nekeva, what do we do with the damim after we pulled it? And the answer is, it depends. When did it become a Baal Mum? If it became a Baal Mum, and he still has an outstanding Chovas Gavra to bring a Korban Pesach, he hasn't yet brought his Korban Pesach, that generates a Kedushas Haguf, according to the Rabbanon, in this animal, which is a female animal, such that now, after there's a mum, he's going to be poded, but he's got to fulfill his original obligation, his commitment to bring a Korban Pesach, and therefore the damim has to go for a Korban Pesach. But if on the other hand, the mum was created after he was already Makayim his Chovas Gavra, he already brought his Korban Pesach, then we might have a situation where it's only Kiddushas, or at least the money could be earmarked for another Korban. So that we'll have to pick up tomorrow. We are now on the left column on page Ches, and that is for tomorrow.